I was 15 years old and freedom-bound during the summer of 2003. I had just finished school for the holidays and earned a 3-month break to do whatever I pleased. Me and my friend Paul had originally planned to stay at home playing video games the entire time, but those plans were soon shot down when I was told that Paul had to stay with his grandparents for a month. Paul spent a good hour or two expressing his love for the farmhouse that his relatives owned, speaking highly of the lakes and the fields that surrounded the family home. Eventually, I gave in. It was clear that I was going to be joining him on his visit. After packing my bags and saying goodbye to my parents, I headed down the road to Paul's house with Alex helping me on the way. Me and Alex were still pretty close, but the older we got, the more we would drift apart. There were no more late-night talks or playing out in the street together, and I missed that. Once we had arrived at the house, Alex said goodbye, dropped my bag, and ran off towards the direction of our local sweet shop. Me and Paul hopped inside the car, and we were on our way. We arrived safely at the farm within an hour or so. It wasn't too far away, but it looked completely different from where we lived. Just a huge house isolated in the middle of nowhere with only hills and trees for company. After we arrived, time seemed to fly by, and before I knew it, we'd already been there for a fortnight. The area was beautiful, and his grandparents were lovely, so I had no complaints. One particular day after dinner, me and Paula decided to head out and explore some more and somehow managed to venture too far. We'd usually spend the evening playing around in the fields or climbing trees, but this time we ended up a mile into the maze of bark. Eventually we reached a small stream and decided to have a rest. The sun lay low and twilight was fast approaching, but we couldn't head back without having time to relax first. After a while, I began to feel as if someone was watching us from the surrounding trees. I looked around countless times, but didn't seem to find anything. I was on the brink of paranoia when Paul frantically pointed out a small wooden box that he'd noticed floating downstream. All too excited to discover what was inside, I hurriedly made my way in the same direction until I was running so fast that I'd overtaken the box completely. I leaned over the bank as far as I could and managed to fish it out from the torrent. I looked back in Paul's direction, expecting him to be nearby, but he was a mile away. I couldn't have run that far, I said to myself. I sat down and slowly opened the box. Inside, I found a small photograph and a scruffy hand-drawn picture. The photo seemed to be of a small boy on his birthday. He was wearing a party hat and stood surrounded by torn wrapping paper, the biggest smile plastered on his face. Once I managed to dry the picture off, I could easily make out a drawing of a family. There were 3 children and 2 parents stood outside of a dirty 2-story home. One of the children looked very sad and was separated from the rest of the family. Upon further inspection, I could see another person in the background, a much bigger man with an expressionless face staring at the corner of the house. It took a minute to register with my mind, but the events that I'd hidden away from 3 years prior all came rushing back. A shiver ran up my spine and I picked myself up off the floor. I began walking back towards Paul, but my legs had gone weak. Then, in the quiet of the darkness, I heard a noise from the trees behind me. Tap, tap, scratch. My legs suddenly worked. I ran towards Paul as we hurriedly made our way back to his grandparents' cabin. Soon after we had arrived home, I managed to settle down. There were still doubts in my mind of who that drawing was, but the noises that followed my discovery kept leading me back to my original fear. Was that me and my family in the drawing? Who was that sad child standing on his own? What does that photograph have to do with anything? I went over these questions in my mind over and over and over, until the phone rang. Paul's grandma handed me the phone and told me it was my brother.
Jack?
Yeah, it's me, Alex. What do you want?
I have something I need to tell you.
Okay, I'm listening.
You know my friend from school, Tom?
I think so. I think I've met him once or twice. Why?
Well, that day after I said goodbye to you, I bumped into him down at the shop.
And?
Well, it turns out he lives on the same street as us. Always has.
So, why is that unusual?
Well, it's not really, I suppose. It's just... Why didn't we ever see him playing on the street?
Maybe he just wasn't allowed to play out when he was younger.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. It's just strange.
It is a bit, but some parents are like that.
I guess so. That's not really the reason I called you anyway. I just found that unusual. I have something else I have to tell you, but it's a big deal. We've never really spoken about it.
Okay. Go on.
Well, today I was at Tom's house and ended up staying over for dinner. It got dark pretty early, so we decided to tell some creepy stories. For some reason, I suddenly remembered that night, you know? That night a few years back. I got the courage to tell him about the man and what he looked like.
Yeah.
Well, he freaked out. He forced his fingers to his ears and started shouting. He kept repeating, "Don't talk about the man! Forget the man!" I didn't know what to do. His mom came running upstairs and told me I had to leave. I'm back at home now anyway. I think I'm safe, so you should never come back, okay?
What? That's when the phone cut off. I immediately rang back, only to be greeted by the sound of white noise. I stood there, shocked at what I heard Alex say. A moment later, he called me back.
Sorry about that. The phone cut off.
It's fine. Don't worry about it. I think we should talk when I get back. Talk properly. I'll be home in a week. See you then.
Cool. See you then, Jack.
After I hung up the phone, Paul questioned me rigorously. I didn't tell him much of anything. There was no need to. And I barely spoke a word for the rest of the time there. After all, I didn't want to sound crazy. But all I could think to myself during that week was that Paul had always lived on the same street as me too. So why didn't I ever see him playing outside when he was younger? Maybe I was thinking too much. I arrived home feeling worse for wear when I noticed that Alex was waiting for me by the door. I was told that Tom's mom had disappeared and left him on his own. All she had taken with her was a jewelry box. Poor Tom went into foster care not long after his mom went missing. It wouldn't be until a couple of years later that I'd meet him again.